Been a very busy week this week in Westminster and across Scotland. I wanted to ask you a question about the Supreme Court's decision. So where does this leave us for the drive towards Scottish independence?
Well, in many ways, a number of my colleagues were a bit surprised and kind of a bit deflated by the result. I wasn't surprised. Wasn't deflated either. I mean, one door is definitely closed, but the door was probably closed anyway. And many other doors open. What's really come about from this is the law lord said that the referendum itself wouldn't have any major legal effect, but what it would have in a democratic culture would carry authority. I think that's really useful, that there's an appreciation of law being subservient to democracy. And I think we've got to let that point sink in a little bit. So what it means going forward is they didn't just talk about the practical point. They talked about I think it was the realistic effects. I'm trying to remember the words from the ruling. But the referendum itself wouldn't have been illegal. The problem with the referendum was what it was going to impact, and the referendum was going to be add without any legal authority, but just add realistic authority and voice and moral authority. Demanded the UK government then respect it and there's only one decision of the referendum, of course, would have to be respected, and that would be the one that would have implications for the UK government, and that would be the one where it would be indicating a support for independence. Now, at that point, the Scottish government at this point couldn't legislate, because the Scottish government or the Scottish Parliament is a creature of Westminster, whether we like it or not, under the 1998 Act, Scotland Act. Tony Blair said when he created the Parliament that it was a parish council, and probably in some ways the Supreme Court underlined the parish council status on Wednesday. So a referendum would have taken us to a point where demands would be made on the Westminster government. Now, legally they wouldn't have to do anything about those demands, but whether it's a democratic culture, as has been mentioned in the ruling, they would carry weight, and they would carry authority, and they would make demands of the UK government. And the UK government, in the international backdrop of Putin and despots all over the place, wouldn't want to be seen, or Lukashenko in Belarus, wouldn't want to be seen in a background where it ignores democracy. So given that the referendum was given expression of democracy, not the referendum itself would be the problem, but the consequences of that would be a problem. And they got into the politics of this, they got into the moral authority that would carry. But if we hold that on one side just for a moment, that is why, and I would say a broad reading of the Scotland Act forbid the referendum, because it's not expressly said in the Scotland Act there's no referendum. Although I did feel before it that we wouldn't have a referendum, and I felt that for 3 years. The bit that the Supreme Court has stopped Scotland getting to the point through a referendum where there is democratic pressure on the UK government on a reserved matter of the Constitution, namely the Parliament and the UK Union. And Tony Blair, as the Scotland Act probably showed, has created a Parliament that is little better on these matters than a parish council. However, there is one glaring omission on the unionist part, and that's the elections. The elections to this Parliament cannot be stopped by any court. And nobody in a democracy can stop any party at any time in the future, at any number of elections, going forward asking the question of the people, do they want independence? And nobody can stop the people at that election to vote for the party that I said, do you want independence? And at that point, if the people do vote for that, that then takes us back to the point where the pressure is on the UK government to obey the will of the people of part of the union, of a constituent part of the union. And so therefore, while some people were crestfallen that the referendum didn't get through, you might only have one shot at a referendum. You might have multiple shots at elections. Of course, the flip side of that is that if we win and we get independence in future Scottish elections or in future referendums in Scotland, people could argue that they want the union back again, and could argue that in perpetuity. It's not an argument I'm particularly worried about, like the unionists are worried about the Scottish independence argument, because I think history tells us that when people win their independence, they don't give it up again. And that would be a very marginal voice, because the voice against independence is one of fear and the sky will fall in. Well, quite manifestly, when we look at countries around about us are doing so much better than Scotland and Wales inside the UK, we won't be in that situation. And so we only have to win once. And we're going to be given many opportunities by the Supreme Court. And the ruling of the Supreme Court, when they were saying, when they're using the particular words of legal and practical effects of the bill are huge. And I think the democratic process, which will be held an expression of the view of the electorate on a specific issue of public policy on a particular concern, is importantly reflected in the first place. And I think that inside these, I think paragraph 74 and paragraph 81 particularly are interesting. A clear outcome, whichever way the question was answered, would possess the authority in a constitutional political culture founded upon democracy of the democratic expression of the view of the Scottish electorate, the clear expression of its wish to remain within the United Kingdom or to pursue secession would strengthen or weaken the democratic legitimacy of the Union, depending on the view prevailed. So therefore, this would have important political consequences related to the United Kingdom and the Union. And that's paragraph 81 of the ruling. And that means that we have an opportunity going forward for an election to do exactly that. And that is, I think, where the ruling has been useful.
Is that backing up what you've been saying for a few years then? And I think I saw you say somewhere just over the last couple of days, Plan A is dead, Plan B is.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, I probably caveated and I said that Plan A was 99% dead. Plan A is now 100% dead. Unless, of course, the UK government agrees to a Section 30. And we all know they're not going to do that if there's a risk of them losing. They came close the last time. They aren't doing it this time. So Scotland can whistle as far as they're concerned. This isn't like the European Union where a member can leave. The UK is not that sort of union of equals and Democrats at all. But the ruling has been fantastic in a way, in that the ruling has been more expansive. The worst outcome, by the way, that could have come was they would have said to the Scottish government, we aren't going to rule until you legislate, which means we'd lose more months, we'd go back there, and then we'd get to where we are today. So rather than being here in 6 to 9 months' time, we're here today. I suppose the criticism you can have is, why wasn't the Scottish government, SNP, ready for a possible ruling like this, ready to put a conference into action immediately if this ruling came the way? Clearly no thinking had happened about that, but it happened, in fairness, quite quickly afterwards, and there's a special conference coming, which I hope is open on which election we will use and isn't going to try to railroad people. And if I take a straw poll of my colleagues that I've spoken to and I've listened to at Westminster in the last SNP colleagues in the last week or this week since the decision, that's the view they have. Let's have a debate about which election. But yeah, this is roughly what I expected. So, and the elections are many. I said that in Prime Minister's questions actually on Wednesday to Rishi Sunak. So opportunities abound.
Yeah, well, it's really nice to hear you have that positive outlook from that decision, because certainly, a lot of people were crestfallen. I'd say there's also a little bit of a groundswell about this idea that the SNP conference should be much broader. And you said, looking at what election to consider to use that mandate. But do you also think there should be a role for the wider independence movement outside the SNP?
Yeah, I mean, I think this isn't about the ego of us. This should be about the good of Scotland and the good of people who are going to move Scotland forward, and to make sure that, as our neighbours are going to see their populations grow, Ireland of 20% the next 30 years, and Iceland of 32%, and then Denmark and Norway of 12 to 15% or whatever it is, and even the tiny Faroes going up 6%, and Scotland falling 2%. That is a sign that we're not in a very healthy state in Scotland. We've got to move Scotland forward, and to do that, we have to take as many people as want to go with us. And I think it's to be inclusive. Now, after independence, we'll be like normal countries where we will vote for parties on various issues. But we know that we've got to sort the first sore thumb out. And the first problem is that we can't enact what we want as a distinctive people, because we get a government elected for us by our neighbours against our cultural and political and economic preferences.
And I'd certainly say that the independence movement doesn't want a party moving without a wider conversation and engagement from that movement. And I do think this is a wonderful opportunity for the SNP to open up the discussion around what we do next. I really do hope they take that forwards.
I mean, I think that there's one very practical problem in all that, and I agree with the general thrust of what you're saying, but the practical problem, and it's probably not an insurmountable problem. The problem is this, is that voting in the SNP comes through the branches and through the delegates from the branches at conference. And where people could be heard and could be part of it, they might feel excluded from votes, which they would be, because not all SNP members can vote at conference, delegates from branches, etc., vote at conference. So I haven't got an answer to that, but I just kind of frankly flag it.
It's the system, isn't it? You know, it looks like the system's not designed to have a much broader church and having an input into these really, really important decisions. And maybe that's where we need to kind of look at things, because we don't just want to push it down the same funnel if we're hoping for something very different at the end of it.
It might be listening to you there that other parties and other entities who are in the same space have their own meetings, conferences, whatever, around the same time, and then they feed in together to something afterwards. I mean, I'm really thinking off the top of my head and the practicalities of that. Yeah. I'm not sure how they fit, but nobody has a monopoly on wisdom on this one. And I think the more ideas we listen to, the better will be the outcome in the end.